The Kennebec River is the one constant in the geography of this part of Maine. For thousands of years, the Kennebec was and continues to be the central theme in the lives of the people who live along its shores and in its valley. Rising at Moosehead Lake, the Kennebec flows 150 miles south, sending nearly 6 billion gallons of water a day flowing into Merrymeeting Bay, the largest freshwater tidal bay in the Northeast. From there, the river proceeds to Popham, where it arrives at its final destination, the Atlantic Ocean. Thousands of years before the first European settlers arrived in the Kennebec River Valley, the river was both home and highway to thousands of Native Americans, including the ancestors of today's Abenakis, Passamaquoddies, and Penobscots. The peoples developed complex and sustainable societies using the river and its valley as a source of food, commerce, trade, and transportation. The first English colony in New England was established in August 1607 at Phippsburg, near the mouth of the Kennebec, and named the Popham Colony. During the year the settlement existed, the colonists began Maine's long tradition of shipbuilding with the 30-ton pinnace Virginia. In 1862, the U.S. built Fort Popham, which still stands near the site of the colonial settlement. Subsequently, settlers established various sites along the river, trading in furs, fish, and timber. By 1754, Fort Western was built at Augusta as a commercial center for trade along the river. That in turn led to the construction of a sawmill and the start of the industrialization of the river. Benedict Arnold used the river to attack Quebec City in 1775, using bateaux built in Pittston and supplies from Fort Western. Thousands of wooden and steel ships were built and launched on the Kennebec, especially at Bath Iron Works, one of the few shipyards still building ships for the U.S. Navy. The Kennebec was famed the world over for the ice, cut in the winters, stored in great ice houses, and shipped all over the world, packed in sawdust, in holds of 2- and 3-masted schooners. Fish, including salmon, sturgeon, and shad, were netted by the ton, salted, and shipped out in barrels to England and beyond. At the same time, the river was a highway for logs floated down the river to reach numerous lumber mills. As more people settled along the Kennebec, the river's great falls were harnessed for power to run factories and to make electricity. Dozens of dams were erected on the main stem and tributaries. The dams, along with pollution from untreated discharges from paper mills, poultry processing plants, and municipalities, led to an end to the great runs of salmon, shad, sturgeon, and alewives on the river. Effectively, the Kennebec became an open sewer, driving people away from its shores. Eventually, public disgust over degradation of the Kennebec led to immense cleanup efforts that have reclaimed the river for its traditional role. Where once the Kennebec boiled with methane, today it flows clear and clean. The reclamation of the Kennebec presents us with tremendous opportunities to take advantage of the river's potential as an aesthetic, natural, historic, economic development, recreational, cultural, and tourism resource for the region and for Maine. In this video presentation, we take a look at the river and hear from people who live, work, and play along its shores and on its waters. We'll discover what people love about the river, the concerns they have about protecting the river today, and what they hope for in the future. The Upper Kennebec stretches from Moosehead Lake to Skowhegan. Flowing from dams at the east and west outlets of Moosehead Lake, the Kennebec begins in mostly undeveloped woodlands. It features some of the heaviest whitewater in the state through the Kennebec Gorge. It also flows through 2 major impoundments. While forestry continues strong here, the Upper Kennebec provides a major recreational attraction in the form of whitewater rafting and fishing for trout and salmon. A mere generation ago, the river was used for a very different purpose. Back then, lumber was king, and the river was used as a highway to bring the felled logs to sawmills further south. Edmund Webb worked on the rivers as a young man and still continues to live near the river today.
Back in the early days, our Long logs was the predominant, the pine and the spruce, the product that filled the waterway. And those logs would be driven by hand in rafts from north of here up the rivers into Bingham and Solon and on down through into Gardner to the big, large sawmills that used to dominate along the riverbanks. They had cooks and cookies, but they also had tents they had to sleep in a lot of times, and beans baked in a bean hole, and even meat sometimes in a cast iron pot, and tea pails, and usually with the tea so strong it would float a horseshoe, and this was typical of the driving camps and the logging camps in the area. In 1976, we was driving the Kennebec River, but that was the last pulpwood drive on the Kennebec River. And of course, logging still continued at a tremendous rate. And instead of the water moving all the wood, it was put onto the highway with trucks. And not long after the wood was on the highway, people began to realize, wow, where'd all them trucks come from? It was a living, and I think it probably, I'd like to try it again, but I know better. It's just one of those things that was taken for granted in those days. We had to move the wood, and water power was the only way to do it.
Back in 1975, Wayne and I moved up to Moosehead Lake, where we started a little business called Backcountry Outfitters, which was catering to hunting and fishermen. Wayne was the guide. So back then, they were still log driving on the Kennebec, but they were about to end the log drives. So he climbed down into the gorge, which is very, very remote below Harris Station, and saw this whitewater. He also saw some great pools, very deep pools that would probably be great salmon fishing. So he was trying to figure out how he's going to get his sports or his fishermen from, down to the pools, and the only way he could think to do it was to use one of these whitewater rafts. And he bought an old 22-foot used British Leyland assault raft. He managed to talk some of the other bear hunters and the other fishermen, guides in the area to go along with them. So they got everybody in the raft, and they took off. As soon as you go around that first corner, it starts to go, and the raft, the white waves were coming in. They never thought to bring bailing buckets. They're using their shoes and their hats and their boots to try to get the water out. It's freezing cold, it's May, and they get to shore, they get out. One of the hunters actually kissed the ground, but the one thing that Wayne was amazed at is how incredibly elated they were. They were all saying, as crazy as it was the best time of their lives, the thrill of it. Today, it is still the mainstream of where the rafters come to. It's the most heavily rafted river in Maine, as opposed to the Dead and the Penobscot. We built a wonderful base in our homes along the river, and the whole community developed around the rafting industry. The economic benefit of this whole area relies on the rafting and the snowmobile industries that have been developed, and that's of course all along the Kennebec.
See, 1999, the communities from the border down to Solon got together and came up with a corridor management plan for this area and called it Old Canada Road. The benefit of being a national recognized byway is that there's funds available for competitive grants to further projects that the neighborhood wants to do. The program is locally driven, which is the benefit of it. It's something that local folks can serve on the board and direct the developments as they see fit. The idea is to create a sustainable tourism environment that everybody can benefit from, whether it's folks all across the country that are visiting or the local residents. And we're working hard to stay within that thought. What we'd like to have the byway do is provide enough exposure so that everybody can be filled to capacity when they want to be, which would be an ideal business, and I think all the business owners would agree with that.
First came here skiing at Squaw when I was a child, but I remember crossing over the river and looking at it. And then when I became much older, college age, I became a raft guide up here running the East Outlet as well as the Kennebec Gorge. I grew up fly fishing, and I finally put two and two together because I've been down this river so many times in kayaks and in rafts. I decided that I would then employ myself as a fly fishing guide. The guiding business has been absolutely positive in so many ways. I meet so many interesting people, and most of the time we can catch fish, but it's absolutely joyful to put a smile on someone's face as we go down the river. It's incredibly beautiful, very scenic. I think that this river as an economic resource has been good to me, but again, I'm just a small cog in a giant wheel of the economy here. And I think that it's important to realize that it's too crowded, no one goes there anymore, and it's very easy to kill the goose that lays the golden egg. And I think if we all put our heads together, we can all come up with a plan that would work best for everyone.
The middle section of the Kennebec, from Skowhegan to Augusta, changes dramatically. The corridor is much more open, with farmlands and larger communities. Below the dam in Skowhegan and on down through Shawmut, the fishery focuses on trout and smallmouth bass. Once the river flows over dams in Waterville, anadromous striped bass, alewives, sturgeon, and shad are present. Tidal effects reach well up the river, past the city of Augusta.
Old Fort Western was built in 1754 as part of an effort by Massachusetts to expand English claims and control over this part of the Kennebec River. The English decided to expand militarily upriver in order to try to secure this area, make it safe for settlement, and extend British influence even farther north. And that sort of military presence extends through the American Revolution as well. Probably more than anything else, Fort Western is known as being one of Benedict Arnold's stops on his way to Canada to try to turn Quebec into the 14th colony, however you want to think about it. And he stops here too for 8 or 10 days on his way, basically to regroup, to organize his forces, to do final planning. This is the one thing in our kind of collective collection that will draw people here. It's the river first. And so when we take care of it, and then when we start to populate the river with a series of other activities and other opportunities for access, direct access to get on the river, or more places to just to view it, long open vistas and that kind of thing, then I think not only will us local folks benefit, the Kennebec Valley will just be that much better a place to live and work and raise our families, but it'll attract other people to this area as well, and they'll learn about what we have, and they'll want to work with us to make sure that we take care of this important resource.
Stephanie Ketzel and Bill Townsend represent two generations who continue to work and play on the Kennebec. Stephanie works for a rafting company and continues to guide people down the upper section of the river. Bill Townsend is the founding president of Maine Rivers and has been a lifelong advocate for the protection of the Kennebec. In conjunction with the Kennebec Coalition, Bill was able to successfully lobby for the removal of the Edwards Dam in Augusta.
It took 10 years, but finally the McKernan administration realized that it would be to the benefit of the river to remove that dam. And after 10 years, that dam was taken out in 1999. And the result has been incredible. The return of the striped bass and the alewives and the sturgeon and all the other species that use the river. And it does, they can swim all the way up to Waterville now. There's wonderful fishing down in Waterville for striped bass. So this river is being reopened for its native fish.
I think as far as the future of the Kennebec, there's so many people that have some great ideas right now. And with all of us that love this resource and want to help protect and develop and conserve it, for me, one of my answers is I think that just some education is when we get people to go out and use the river, and the more people we can get involved, especially like the younger population, get them involved in the grassroots level. Because I think without people coming and seeing the resource, it's not going to be there. We need their voice to help get others to preserve the Kennebec.
I was born and brought up in Gardner, and the river was in those days the classic open sewer that so many people talk about, that it bubbled and foamed in the summer and the fumes rose and the paint peeled off the houses along the river. And cities and towns gradually abandoned the river. We moved back, we looked at lakes, we went farther out into the countryside to find water that we could use. We moved away, as so many Maine people do, for education, for jobs, and came back. And coming back, found the river cleaner, more accessible. Well, one key to the health of the river is the focus that municipalities have on the river and their use of the river as the backbone of their economic revitalization plans. And one nice thing about cities and towns using the river to anchor their downtowns is that it's a way of concentrating economic development in a place where existing infrastructure is available for commercial growth, arts and culture growth, housing, recreation on the downtown. A key element of preserving the ability of downtowns to use the river is to preserve the cleanliness of the river, the free flow of the river, and to provide significant opportunities for public access for the river, both for tourists and for people who live here in Maine to use the river. Now, who should be involved in helping to protect the river? It's clearly a partnership of federal government, state government, municipal governments, land trusts, conservation organizations, and just ordinary people like you and me who have a stake in the health of the river and the ability of the river to continue to be the anchor for prosperity that it's been for Maine for almost 200 years.
The Lower Kennebec, from Augusta to the sea, changes drastically once again. The river's industrial history is still very much in evidence here, including active shipbuilding at Bath Iron Works. The river becomes big water here, including wildlife-rich Mary-Beating Bay. The river becomes salty below the chops and reverses its direction with each rising and falling tide.
The first settlement, of course, was the Popham Colony in 1607-08 at the very mouth of the river. By the mid to late 1620s, the Pilgrims, as we know from Massachusetts, they were on the river here in the Augusta area with the trading posts trading for furs to pay for their passage over from Europe. They were here until 1675-76 when the first of the wars with the Native Americans occurred. And at that time, all European settlers were driven out of Maine, out of this part of Maine certainly. But it was really not until 1715 or so that permanent settlement came back to this area. Shipbuilding, believe it or not, was a big industry here. The wood products industry was always big, but they actually built many ships in Richmond and Pittston, and these were ships that not only took the product away, whether it was lumber or ice, but it also allowed people from this area to become international merchants and to bring a lot of outside influences into this area as well. There are still a lot of people who are directly involved with the natural environment and their land. There are still farmers, there are still people who fish in this area. Now we see more celebration of the river. We see people making a living as guides on the river. We see a lot more recreational boating, for instance. We do need to work harder to show what's unique about this area and to use that uniqueness as a way to bring money into the communities and into people's pockets.
I have a passion for rivers, and in fact, I have an obsession with the Kennebec. For the last 40 years, I've spent a good part of my life on this river. And of course, it's fishing that draws me to it, but really, it's the river itself. You know, I don't want to overstate, but rivers are actually magical things because they're never the same 2 days. They're changing all the time. Kennebec in particular. These days, the communities along the Kennebec, particularly in the stretch from Augusta to Gardner, they're starting to figure out that you can't just have something like a river and let whatever happen to it that does.
The truth of the matter is we have to be very careful about how we construct the future for the river. It's a beautiful thing today, but it wouldn't take an awful lot to change it in the future. What we need now is an organized approach to make sure that what we have in the Kennebec today isn't lost, and that what we have in the future is better. Now that's not an easy trick to pull off, and all the folks who live in the communities along the river, we're going to have to work together to make that happen. I love the idea that my grandchildren will get to enjoy the river the way I do, that it'll be full of fish, that it'll be clean, and that people will adore the river. To me, that means a great deal. After all, 4 decades of being on the river, watching it change, watching it get better year by year, that means a lot.
It's easy to see how the Kennebec has shaped the history and economy of the valley it flows through, from the beginning through today. What's harder to say is what the future will bring. The Kennebec River Initiative seeks to help shape that future by working with all the people who live, work, and play along the Kennebec. This is your invitation to join us in that effort.